We'll get to you for a response that I see you have, but let me just bring in Sal Landau here, and I'd like to expand, Sal Landau, on what Westwood Griffin Tarpley said, disturbing signs by Turkey of independent action. It certainly looks like that. I mean, Ibrahim Kalin, the foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Erdogan, he said Turkey retaliated without declaring war, but doesn't the resolution reached in the parliament lay the groundwork for war when Turkey deems it necessary? Parliament's, a quick reminder here, authorized the government to send Turkish forces to foreign countries with the administration determining the where, the scope, the numbers, and the time of such deployment.
I think it is a dangerous situation, and I don't think it should be underplayed. I mean, I have the feeling that the Archduke might be visiting Sarajevo any day now. I mean, laying the conditions for a much larger conflict as the one that started World War I. I mean, the fact is that Syria, which has bent over backwards to please the United States over the last 10 years, they tortured people that were sent there for rendition. They tipped the United States off about possible attacks against U.S. bases and property there in the region. And I remember when I was in Syria and a government official said, "Why is it that Washington doesn't respond to our deeds?" And I said, "No good deed goes unpunished." Syria is, after all, essentially allied with Iran, and that is what is really in disfavor. And I think it's true that the West, along with Saudi Arabia, is arming and training the foreign troops that are going into Syria and fomenting much of the violence that is occurring there on an unprecedented scale. It is very dangerous, and I think you have Russia on one side and China also, which is opposing Western action. And then you have the NATO powers using essentially Turkey. When Turkey's, I don't understand President Erdogan's ambition in this particular case. The Syrians have told him very clearly they don't want to go to war with Turkey. It's been a peaceful situation. I also don't understand why Israel is supporting this move against President Assad, because Assad has maintained stability on the Golan Heights. And if a new regime replaces this in Turkey, it may very well be led by very fundamentalist jihadists who will not respect that Golan Heights border. So it's a very dangerous situation, and I think the West should back off. And President Obama should be advised to do so immediately.
The U.S. Defense Secretary has confirmed that Washington sent troops to the Jordan-Syria border in what's seen as America's growing involvement in the conflict now. Leon Panetta says the task team is there to enhance Jordan's capabilities in case violence spills over from Syria. Artie's Gunich Chikad's got the latest from Washington.
According to Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, they sent the troops to Jordan-Syrian border in case violence escalates in Syria and spills over the border. Leon Panetta did not go into details as to how many troops and so on, but another U.S. defense official speaking on condition of anonymity said the forces are made up of 100 military personnel and other personnel who stayed on in Jordan after attending an annual exercise in May. And several dozen more have flown in since. They are operating from the joint U.S.-Jordanian military center north of Amman that Americans have used for years. The news about U.S. military personnel so close to Syria, that is boots on the ground, of course suggests an escalation in the U.S. military involvement in the conflict, even as Washington pushes back on any suggestion of a direct intervention in Syria. But Jordan is not the only place where the U.S. has military presence. If we look at Syria and the U.S. military presence in the region, we see that Syria is pretty much surrounded militarily. Also, tension is growing on the border between Syria and Turkey after several days of shelling. This Wednesday, Turkey's military chief vowed to respond with more force. That is a day after NATO said it stood ready to defend Turkey. But this latest development with U.S. troops in Jordan comes with the U.S. presidential election less than a month away, at a time when Mitt Romney, Barack Obama's challenger, is criticizing the president for not being aggressive enough, for quote unquote, sitting on the sidelines for missing the opportunity to topple Assad and, quote, deliver that defeat to Iran. Yes, he actually said that. So it's not clear whether this latest announcement about Jordan is the administration's way of showing teeth in this election campaign, or whether an intervention in Syria is really coming soon. One of the reasons why the rebels refuse to settle for a negotiated solution through dialogue is the signal that they get, that sense that support is on the way, that there will be an intervention. But everybody understands without a negotiated solution, the bloodshed will continue. So the signals that the rebels are getting, including the news about U.S. troops standing by across the border, could be making it that much harder to come to that negotiated solution.
Garnet Chichikan. Well, independent journalist Niall Bowie thinks border protection is just a pretext to press harder for a change of the Syrian regime.
Throughout the duration of the conflict in Syria, we've heard a lot of talk about the creation of humanitarian corridors or buffer zones along the Turkish border, and now we're hearing reports of the same being established on the Jordanian border. So ostensibly that is what the American personnel in Jordan are there to do. But one needs to acknowledge the fact that this is not the policy of the Turkish government, nor is it the policy of the Jordanian government. The U.S. think tank, the Brookings Institute, in March 2012 published a report titled Assessing Regime Change Options in Syria, where they specifically cite the creation of a buffer zone or humanitarian corridor as a means to base certain rebel groups in the region to project force towards the Syrian government in an attempt to topple it. So that appears to be what is playing out at the moment.
The idea of giving heavy artillery to these so-called buffer zones is the most cynical thing imaginable. It's going to create civil war. It's going to create bloodshed, anything but peace, as your commentator pointed out just previous to our discussion here. So this is one of the most dangerous moves of the whole Syrian engagement by NATO in the last 18 months.
But surely by France giving the Syrian rebels heavy artillery and possibly anti-aircraft guns, hopefully, according to them, that will help to sow the seeds of a peaceful democracy.
Well, I think if you look at what the Muslim Brotherhood has been reported doing since they took the presidency in Egypt, you'll see that the Syrian opposition is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, the same organization, and their long-term agenda is introducing an Al-Qaeda or Taliban-like fanatical Islamic Sharia law into Syria and ending the tolerance of different religions, which has been the trademark of Syrian life for decades under the al-Assad family, but in general. And there are reports from journalists inside Syria over the last months of the so-called opposition. In many cases, they're Al-Qaeda or Mujahideen that have been brought in from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere and provided guns and weapons, that they have beheaded civilians and blamed the atrocities on the Assad government. So this is really, I don't know what you could call the equivalent of the Fabius recognition of a government in exile or building a government in exile. Perhaps if the Russian government were to recognize the Ku Klux Klan as a government in exile in America and provided heavy artillery so that they could go against Washington.
I got an email from someone in Syria, and I said I wouldn't read her name. I'm living in Syria. My city is Aleppo. We have lots of problems here. All these terrorists are coming from other countries and killing here the people. And almost all media out there not telling the truth. They're telling that our government are killing innocent people. This is not true. We are Christians living here, but we are now in danger. Syria isn't like Yemen or Libya. There are huge numbers of Christians here, but U.S. and some Europe governments don't caring about Christians here, just sending money and weapons to those people.
Demonstrating alliance solidarity, the Dutch, German and Turkish defense ministers have paid a visit to NATO Patriot batteries in Turkey. At an airbase in the southern city of Adana, the Dutch defense minister thanked her troops for their efforts. She said the Netherlands is proud to contribute to the protection of the Turkish people and their territory.
It's important for the Netherlands to be part of this mission because an ally and a country that we have close relationships with already for decades, ask for assistance. So we acted accordingly to the Netherlands. The NATO solidarity does matter. And when we received the request, we said yes, and Parliament supported it. And the same goes for Germany and the United States.
The Syrian government maintains it's fighting terrorists, armed and controlled from abroad. Well, for more on what's happening in and around the war-torn country, I'm now joined live by political analyst Sukant Chandan. Sukant, NATO says that these missiles will act as a deterrent and they will de-escalate the conflict. So presumably a welcome move, this deployment of these missiles.
When has NATO ever been interested in the human rights of the people of the global south? Never. They've only been interested in domination and trauma, as we can see most profoundly and illustratively in relation to what they've done in Libya. So this is not in any way going to help the Turkish and especially the Syrian people. It's another step towards the final nail in the coffin, which the NATO hopes is the regime change against Syria. Now, we just had the conflict in Gaza, and I've been saying for a good part of 2 years that the resistance in Gaza has realized that it wants to have an open battle of war of liberation with the Zionist state and their Western backers to refocus this whole essentially pro-NATO in its policies Arab Spring, or should I call it the NATO Arab Sting, in the region. And with the resistance in Gaza that we saw just a few days ago, that's exactly what happened. Everything was starting to be exposed. Morsi was exposed as nothing better than Mubarak, and also it showed that the real enemy of the Arabs is the Zionist state and their backers, and that the Syria, Hezbollah and Iran were fundamental to the victory of the resistance in Gaza. And just like all the Arab armies were arrayed against Saddam back in the beginning of the 90s, similarly, now Ba'athist Syria can turn the whole situation around if it does only what Saddam Hussein did at that time, which was to launch a war of liberation against the Zionist state itself. The Scuds flew at Tel Aviv back in the early 90s. We saw the Fajr 5s from Iran, Hezbollah and Syria flying at Jerusalem and Tel Aviv last week. And it's this, if Syria can focus on this struggle, the Arab masses, the Muslim masses and the masses of the global south will rally to its cause. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a slow slide towards regime change in Syria, which is just an awful tragedy.
You talked about the launch of Scud missiles. Are you actually saying that these Patriot missiles will be used and actually be fired into Syria?
Well, they're deployed there. Well, what else is military hardware used, if not for either for military pressure?
Turkey's saying that they're using them. Obviously, they're saying they will need them to defend their citizens because some Turks have been killed already. Is Syria deliberately targeting Turkey?
No, of course Syria is not. Syria has no interest, and actually Turkey has no interest to ratchet up things against Syria either, because Turkey, after Syria, which I've said before, is the #1 loser in this whole situation in Syria, because they're negatively impacted by the refugees. Erdogan is becoming less and less popular inside Turkey because of his Syria policies. So this is not at all in the interest of Syria and Turkey. This is NATO taking Turkey along into this disastrous mess. But NATO are clever, or they're clever because our side is stupid, because on the one hand they're using Turkey against Syria, but also they're weakening Turkey in relation to Syria as well, because the West are very clever. They know that although Turkey is an ally today, tomorrow it could be a regional power against the West, which it was before this whole Syria debacle, when Turkey had excellent relations with Syria, Iraq, Iran.
Sorry, you say the West is very clever, but has it really worked out what it'll do once Assad goes?
As Samar Amin, who's one of the best analysts of anti-imperialism in the global south from Egypt, has said, the West is only interested in destroying all Arab societies in order to create trauma, deep trauma within those societies, so it can facilitate the war and regime change operation against Iran successfully. This and only this is what the West is interested in right now in the Middle East, North African region.
Just a quick word about the threat of chemical weapons. That's been cited as another reason to deploy these Patriot missiles. Is that really a serious threat? Isn't the worry that, well, if there is a power vacuum, what happens to these alleged chemical weapons? That's the worry, isn't it?
Now, I'm glad you raised the issue about chemical weapons, because there's a few points to be made. One, this is an obvious war propaganda trick by the NATO powers to justify in the minds of the public that a bombing campaign should be conducted by NATO, at least a no-fly zone, against the Ba'athist Syrian government. Okay. But the second point is that I've been to Vietnam, to the orphanages and to the government support centers of those children affected by Agent Orange because of the US bombing of Vietnam. We know that what depleted uranium has done to Iraq in terms of the newborns, deformities, and Winston Churchill was the first leader of any power to use chemical weapons against who? Against what he called the savage tribes in Iraq in the early 1920s. So really putting some historical context to